Hello there, Pastor Scott Dalen here, and starting to kick off a new series of videos for an ongoing Bible study going on in my congregation. If you have paid attention before, you know I did a series of these about a year ago, roughly, over the course of a pretty lengthy amount of time as we explored an ongoing narrative study based on something called the story. So perhaps you have seen this type of thing before. That series, once that finished up last spring, almost a year ago, then that group kind of went on hold, and then last fall we did a series on the book of Galatians that lasted for a few weeks. Did not do any videos for those, but now that group is beginning to study the book of Romans, which will go on for quite a while. And so I'm going to try and do these videos as a companion to go along with that as well, just to kind of allow anyone who was unable to join us for the evening discussion to kind of stay on top of what's going on. So when we began last night, we kind of did a brief introduction to the book of Romans itself, and then we went into chapter 1. We also talked some just about the background of the Apostle Paul and his life and his writings that I've talked about with that group before. So we didn't go super in-depth on it this time around, but just for you, kind of a little bit of background. We know as we look at the New Testament, there's basically two types of writings for the most part, generally speaking. There's gospels or narrative that we see in the four gospels as well as in the book of Acts. And then there are epistles or letters that make up the rest of the New Testament. Now, of those letters, the Apostle Paul is credited with writing quite a few of them, 13 of them, of the 21 that are present. So Paul is credited with writing a lot of the New Testament. However, some scholars do debate whether or not he actually wrote all of the letters that are attributed to him. Of the 13, some of them are disputed. They call them undisputed and disputed. The undisputed ones, everybody's like, yeah, we're pretty sure he wrote these. The disputed ones are kind of like, well, the writing style is a little different. Some of the themes are a little bit different, so we're not 100% sure that he actually wrote them. They might have been written pseudo-biographically, which is a big fancy word that's attributed to a very common thing at that time, that someone would write in the name of someone else, a contemporary or student or someone of that nature. So so I'm writing as Paul. It's kind of the anti-plagiarism, whereas plagiarism is like, I'm going to take what you wrote and say that I wrote it. This is like, I'm going to write it and say that you wrote it. So that's kind of what's going on. But Romans itself is one of the undisputed letters. Even though it's presented first in the New Testament, it's actually thought to be one of the latest ones that Paul wrote, probably shortly before his final imprisonment. Well, no, I take that back. Take back that imprisonment thing. But it's considered one of the latest ones that Paul wrote. Kind of dated mid first century, about somewhere between about the year 54 to maybe 56 or 57 AD or CE as we call it now. That's kind of where it's at. To back up just a little bit, the letters of Paul are presented in the New Testament in order of length. Definitely not chronological, but Romans is the longest, so it's first, and then they gradually get shorter as the New Testament moves through his different letters. So if you're ever reading them, that's kind of what's going on there. We talked a little bit more then about his general writing style. Paul was very well educated at the time, very familiar with the rhetoric of the day. So most of his letters follow a pretty specific pattern. He'll open it up by identifying himself and then his intended recipient, like who he's writing to. Then he offers a greeting to them, and sometimes those are kind of mixed up. Then he goes through a prayer of thanksgiving. Basically, it's kind of a time when he butters up the people. These are the wonderful things that I have heard about you, and what I know. Then he moves into the theme or the main body of the letter, and depending on the letter, this can be either really short or it can be pretty lengthy. It's pretty lengthy here in Romans because it's a long book. Then he'll kind of begin to wrap things up in his closing. Oftentimes he'll call out specific people that he knows will be in his audience, and then usually there's like maybe some final instructions and closing prayer. That's kind of the typical style. Now Romans follows this for the most part, but what's interesting about Romans, as compared to some of his other letters, is that Romans was written to an audience that Paul did not know. He had not yet visited Rome. He did not establish this church or this community of believers, whereas most of his other letters were written to groups or churches that he had helped form on his various missionary journeys. So this one is different. We talked a little bit about this last night of what is maybe his intention for introducing himself to Rome, and why does he want to get to Rome so bad and interact with this group of believers? And we didn't really have a good answer to that, other than Paul, as a Roman citizen, which he was, would know, he would be familiar with kind of the workings of perhaps the political system and the societal system, and knowing that in the Roman Empire, Rome itself is the crown jewel, and that's the center of everything. So perhaps there would be great influence there within this community, within this church, and that's why he so desired to get there. Now he did eventually get there, and Paul was imprisoned in Rome twice, once under house arrest for a period of a couple of years, but he was very active in doing ministry there in the house that he was confined in. Then the second one was a little more dire. He was kept there in more of a dungeony type situation, where he was eventually executed. But so that's kind of some background on Paul and his letters and his writing, as well as the book of Romans. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 1, which again is what we covered in the discussion last night. Chapter 1 is about, how many verses? Let me look. About 32 odd verses, and it's interesting that there is again, as I mentioned before, he kind of has the introductory period where he's introducing himself. And what's interesting about this is the introduction of Paul, which is about the first 7 verses, almost serves as a mini gospel. We talked about that notion last night, that Paul is introducing himself, but he very much takes the focus away from himself and places it on Christ, and who Christ is and where Christ came from, and the good news of the gospel, all of that we are called to be apostles, or we are called to be ministers for him. That's kind of the focus of this initial part, which we found to be interesting. It shows a humbleness about Paul, that he understands that Christ is greater than he is, but that he finds joy in being called to do this ministry, and that he hopes to be able to do it among the Romans, or the Roman church. As we talked about that, we also discussed a little bit about who or what culture that might have been, if they were Jewish converts or if they were Gentile converts. And it's thought that the church in Rome was probably a mix of the two. There had been a Jewish presence in Rome. The previous emperor had actually cast all the Jewish people out, not necessarily killed them, but had cast them out, didn't want them around. But then a different emperor came to power and allowed them to come back. So we see a little bit of evidence of that throughout the rest of the book, not necessarily so much here in the opening chapter. But so that introduction is going on. Then we move, verses 8 through 17 is kind of that Thanksgiving section, where Paul is kind of buttering the people up a little bit. Now we talked about that a little bit. Is he blowing smoke? Does he know that as Romans, maybe these are some more movers and shakers compared to some of the other communities that he communicates with? Maybe, we don't know, but what we can take from Paul's words is that he's encouraged by the reputation that they have, that has traveled around, that he has heard about them. He hopes to be encouraged by them, but he also hopes to encourage them and learn mutually from one another. And That's interesting because Paul, humble though he may be, still has a pretty high opinion of himself as an apostle, as an authority within the greater church. And so for him to be like, I hope to learn from you as well, that's a pretty big deal. And again, is he blowing smoke? Maybe. Is he being honest? Probably. But it's interesting that is in there. He definitely has a very high opinion of them. One quick point that I want to bring up is in this, he says the words, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who has faith." This is kind of the introduction to the notion of faith, and something that's very, very prominent within the book of Romans is the importance of faith. And I oftentimes joke that I think Paul was a good Lutheran, 1,500 years before there were Lutherans, but his notion of the importance of believing the promises of God that are spoken to us, that are given to us, that faith is not faith and salvation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not about what we do, but it's about believing what God has said about us. And so that theme begins to emerge here. But what's interesting is in the final section, which is a little bit lengthier, it's verses 18 through 32 of chapter 1, Paul really switches gears and almost seems to be throwing down the gauntlet about the wrath of God for human unrighteousness. And at first glance, Paul seems very, very judgmental in what he's saying. And we discussed, what is his intention for that? Is Paul taking a shot at the Romans? Is he taking a shot at the Roman Christians? Is he speaking more generically? What exactly is he doing? And we see different portions about the wrath of God being shown from heaven against all ungodliness. That goes in there. He talks some about how God has revealed himself to the world through creation, and yet we, thinking that we are smarter than we are, turn away and have created graven images for ourselves, and we have worshipped those. He talks about different sinful actions. A lot of it, he starts talking about sexual sin. That's a pretty healthy chunk of this, but he doesn't limit it to that. He also he makes a very big list of other sinful nature as well: wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness, gossiping, slandering, being insolent, haughty, boastful. I mean, it kind of goes on and on and on. And what's interesting is he talks about, for God gave them up to their desires, that God gave them up to these different things. That phrase itself is in this section 3 different times, and we really kind of focused on that. I sort of expected to focus maybe a little bit more on the very specific sexual nature of what Paul presents here. We didn't really get into that in our discussion last night, which is okay. But we focused more on the general idea of sinfulness and turning inward in our inward desires, just from the sinful sense. And where is the basis of all this coming from? And it came up in our conversation that it seems that Paul is really holding on to his Jewish background, his Jewish knowledge and training and religious experience, I suppose, is the way to say that. It seems to be his Jewishness is very much on display here, which is interesting because for Paul, his idea is the new creation. It doesn't matter if you're Jew or Greek, if you're male or female, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's from Galatians. But when you are in Christ, you are a new creation, and the law no longer applies to you. And yet, we can still see his Jewish influence present here. I'm going to wrap this kind of up with the final point that sort of came up that we focused on and discussed. Again, Paul seems very judgmental in this last portion, regardless of who that's aimed at. If he's speaking generically about humanity, if he's speaking generically about Roman society, if he's speaking generically about Jewish society, if he's speaking generically, or if he's speaking specifically, regardless. Chapter 1 ends, and chapter 2, which we'll get into next week, picks up with you have no excuse when you judge others, for you are under the same level of judgment. So he starts with this and then immediately turns it on its ear of judge, 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 but how dare you judge when you do the same things? So we really kind of we picked up on that in a preview for the next week, and found that to be interesting, and found that to be very truthful about our sense of faith now. And we kind of ended as we discussed different denominational understandings of faith and judgment and repentance and all of that. That's kind of how we ended up last night. If you have thoughts or questions or comments, I hope that you have read chapter 1 of Romans, or if you're interested by some of the background information about Paul and Romans that I presented, by all means share those down in the comments and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, just get in touch with me if you're interested, and we can converse directly as well. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week. We'll catch you next time with Romans chapter 2.